What is the most interesting, because you've been exposed to so much research on the subject of dopamine and human behavior. Is there a particular study that always stands in your mind as being the most informative or interesting or surprising that you've encountered?
A study that keeps coming back to me, there are a couple. I mean, there's so many, but...
Give me them.
Okay. So if you put a rat in a cage with a rat trapped in a plastic bottle, that rat will work very hard to free the trapped rat. But if you then allow that rat to self-administer heroin, it will not work to free the trapped rat. To me, that's really powerful because it suggests how addictive substances like opioids, which heroin is, can usurp our desire for human connection and essentially become the object of attachment. And we often talk about loneliness and isolation as a risk factor for addiction, which it absolutely is. But the reverse is also true, that getting addicted will cause us to isolate and be lonely. We will stop caring about other people. So for me, that's a really powerful, kind of experiment that I think does map on to human behavior.
Something really interesting, this on just a day-to-day level, which in your head, I was trying to relate that to my own life and thinking, if I get really addicted to my screens and my devices, when my partner needs me,
right,
I might be so distracted and so connected to the thing that's giving me dopamine upstairs in my bedroom, like my laptop or whatever on my work, that I might completely miss her call for help. And I kind of, I hate to say it, but sometimes I do feel like maybe I've been guilty of that.
Yeah.
I've been so, dare I say the word, addicted to my work or devices or whatever that, sometimes I'm not present with meeting other people's needs.
Absolutely. And, that certainly happened to me with my addiction to romance novels, right? I stopped paying as much attention to my kids and to my husband. We went on a vacation with another family at the beach, and instead of joining folks on the beach, I stayed in the room and read romance novels. We went to a neighbor's party, and I actually found a room in the house and read romance novels instead of socializing, and didn't even think that was weird, even though that's obviously really strange. So it is this kind of coming to overvalue our drug of choice and undervalue other more meaningful good things in our lives.
Could you theoretically say it's making the world less empathetic or less sympathetic or less, what's the adjective of actually being there for other people? I guess connection and relationships, it's hurting our ability to connect to others and have empathy for them and be there for them because we're possessed by the thing giving us the most dopamine.
Yeah, I would go even further and say not only is it making us less empathetic, but it's actually making us sociopathic. In other words, when people are in their addiction, they can deviate from their moral compass because they so overvalue this drug of choice that they lose sight of their own values. And we see this with kids who become addicted to video games or social media. They stop participating in family life. They stop treating their parents with respect. They stop participating in household chores. They become essentially antisocial. And when they get off of digital media and they go through that terrible withdrawal period, all that gets worse, and even they will endorse things like wanting to hurt their parents or wanting to hurt themselves. But if they can just go long enough and abstain, from digital media, they will come out the other side, and parents will talk about getting their child back, and getting back, this person that that they recognize as their child. So I think this is really important. When people are in their addiction, they can look very personality disordered, very narcissistic, very borderline, very sociopathic. And when they get into recovery, that's not who they are at all. And they can really become themselves again.
I read about a really extreme case where that drug, I believe it's called pramipexole, which is a dopamine agonist.
Yes.
Which essentially means, I guess the molecule is the same shape as dopamine. So it kind of, the brain treats it like dopamine.
Yes.
And these people were given it for twitchy leg or something.
Right.
And then they, like so many of them lost their minds. They became obsessed with like compulsive, impulsive behaviors. And I was reading about one particular lady. She would leave the house in the early hours of the morning when she was taking this drug, which kind of is the same as dopamine. And she would wear see-through tops. This was like a normal woman who otherwise had a normal life, and go to very dangerous places to try and have sex with strangers. And it was because her brain was full of this drug which simulated dopamine. But there's so many examples. There was one from Australia where a woman was taking this drug which is like dopamine in terms of its molecular structure, and she would sit on these slot machines until she soiled herself and urinated on herself. She ended up losing her house, losing her car, losing her marriage, just because they'd given her this drug which is the same as dopamine. And it made me realize that dopamine isn't necessarily the drug of reward, but more of like wanting and impulse and desire. Is that an accurate assessment of it? Like, it makes you desire things. And there was other examples when I was reading about it where a guy would take this drug and started engaging in homosexual sex acts, whereas otherwise he'd been in a heterosexual relationship. It was all very confusing, but it says something to me about what dopamine is actually doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we're talking about addictive substances and behaviors, the initial response of the brain is to release a lot of dopamine all at once in the reward pathway. But with repeated use, dopamine release gets weaker and shorter in duration, and eventually it leads to this dopamine deficit state. And that's often what we call wanting but not liking. So, and George Koob has called this dysphoria-driven relapse, where now they're using, not to feel good, but just to stop feeling bad and feel normal. So in that sense, dopamine is part of pleasure. I mean, that's not, it's not its sole function. But when it comes to addictive substances and behaviors, the initial encounter has to feel good or be reinforcing or get someone out of pain, right? It has to solve that problem. But again, the issue is that with repeated use, it stops doing that, but there's still that motivation to reuse again and again. And when we're thinking about like exogenous or external sources of just giving someone dopamine, that's not going to work to treat that dopamine deficit state, because it's going to bind indiscriminately to dopamine receptors throughout the brain. And the brain will respond with that same process of neuroadaptation where it's downregulating, dopamine receptors, which is, again, what is setting us up for this repeated addictive pattern.
Is there any other studies that were shocking to you and that have always stayed with you?
Another really interesting study is if you expose a rat to a single injection of cocaine and then slice open its brain, you'll see this arborization of dopamine-releasing neurons in the reward pathway. So that means a proliferation of neurons that release dopamine, a kind of growth of the dopamine forest, so to speak. But by the way, you'll see that same arborization or growth of dopamine-releasing neurons if you put a rat in a complex maze, right? Which is to say a maze where they can explore and find different things and have challenges. If you then cut that rat's brain open, you'll see that same arborization of dopamine. So in other words, learning is highly rewarding, and dopamine is released in response to novelty and new things and new challenges. But if you then take that rat and pre-treat it with methamphetamine and put it in the maze and then look at its brain, you don't see any additional arborization beyond what you got with methamphetamine. And the interpretation there is that drugs actually may usurp or steal our ability to learn, right? Because they've, again, this idea of sort of they've taken over. It's such a powerful dominant stimulus that there's no additional growth or neuroplasticity in response to something like learning a maze.
And does that mean that when that rat was in the maze the first time and its brain was full of dopamine, dopamine was therefore playing a role in helping it to learn?
No, so the learning itself actually caused proliferation. So dopamine is responsive not just to rewards, not just to pleasurable things, but it's actually responsive to pain, it's responsive to novelty. So it's responsive to any emotionally powerful experience. So when you put a rat in a maze and it explores that maze, that's an enriching, exciting experience for the rat because we are creatures who are evolved to seek and explore and learn new territory and then move on and do the same thing.
So you could say then that if I'm taking an addictive substance like cocaine, I'm going to be much less likely to go out and explore the world.
Yes, exactly. Or if you do explore the world, your capacity to be rewarded by that experience will decrease or will not be there.
So I'm less likely to do it then.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, this highlights a bit more of a fundamental link around like motivation. Like if you're addicted to something, if you're addicted to pornography, your ability to like get up and go out and get a job might be diminished.
Absolutely. I mean, what happens with addiction is that we have a narrowing of our focus on our drug of choice, such that that's the only thing that's reinforcing for us, and other things lose their rewarding potential. And eventually they fall away altogether, and we're spending all of our time getting our drug, using our drug, trying to get more as we come down. Can I talk about another experiment, which I think is interesting? Another really interesting experiment is the rat park experiment. And this is the work of Bruce Alexander. And he essentially said, well, if you put a rat in a cage with nothing else to do but press a lever for cocaine, of course that's what they're going to do because there's nothing else happening. But what if you put a rat in a very enriched environment with a lever to press cocaine, but also lots of other things to do, other rats, chutes and mazes, little, sawdust balls. What he discovered was that the rat is much less likely to press that lever as often because it has other reinforcing things to do. And I think that was really groundbreaking in the sense that it is true that addictive substances and behaviors work on the brain in this very predictable way that's so reinforcing that even if you have a great life, you can get addicted. But it's also true that our environment really matters. And if we're living in an impoverished environment like that single rat in a cage with nothing else to do, we're much more likely to get addicted than if we live in this really enriched environment where we have lots of other sources of reward, lots of other sources of dopamine. And based on that work, there was something then called the Icelandic experiment. And this is quite some years ago now, but Iceland had a significant youth drug problem. And the way that they decided to intervene was to build a lot of gymnasiums and emphasize youth sports. And as we've talked about, exercise and sports are a healthy way in general, if you don't overdo it, to get dopamine because you're paying for it up front, right? You're working for it. And Iceland saw a significant reduction in their youth drug use problem after the implementation of this youth sports system. So I think that's a nice way it's a nice example of how an animal model can actually provide some kind of fundamental frame to understand what's happening in the brain that can be then translated to a real world implementation.
Radical honesty.
Okay, so radical honesty is something that I learned about from my patients. And it was the observation that my patients who were able to get into sustained recovery from severe addictions had learned that they couldn't lie. And it wasn't just that they couldn't lie about their drug use. They couldn't lie about anything. So they couldn't lie about why they were 5 minutes late for a meeting. They couldn't lie about why they couldn't go to a party. They had to tell the truth in all things large and small. And to me, that was fascinating. And it was an idea that I started to play with and experiment with in my own life. And I realized that telling the truth is actually really hard because we're all prone to little lies to kind of cover up our shortcomings. These are things that we hardly even notice. They're also like lies of exaggeration to make ourselves more interesting, lies of flattery where we tell other people how great they are, even though we don't necessarily believe that. So all these little lies that we tell, I think even if you're not struggling with addiction, these lies can erode our lives, make our lives more impoverished. And I think, it's working through many different mechanisms. So the question then becomes, why is truth-telling or radical honesty protective? And I think it's working across many different levels. But one of the important levels that it's working across is simple awareness. Because when we're lying to other people, we're also actually lying to ourselves. And when we're lying to ourselves, we actually don't know what we're doing, right? And when it comes to our consumptive behaviors, on the one hand, I may know that I'm watching too many videos at the same time, really not know that I'm doing that, right? So, but when I tell another human being exactly what I'm consuming, how much and how often, then it becomes real to me in a way that it's not when it's sort of pinging around in the dark recesses of my own mind. So that awareness is really important because we can't change our behaviors unless we're aware of what we're doing. The other aspect of that that's really important that I've learned over many years of being a psychiatrist is that the way that people tell their autobiographical narrative is really important, and that there are healthy ways we can tell our stories and also not so healthy ways. And what I've observed is that when people are telling stories in which they're always the victim of other people or circumstance, I know pretty well that they're not going to get into recovery. But if they start telling a story that acknowledges their own contribution to their problem, whatever it is, including the problem of addiction, then I'm pretty confident that we're headed in a good direction. And that's really interesting because what it means is that our autobiographical narratives provide a template for our lives. They're not just a way to organize past experience. They actually provide a roadmap for the future. And if we're telling self stories that are a more accurate representation of what's actually happening in our lives, we will have more information from which to make better decisions going forward.
So victimhood keeps you stuck.
It keeps you stuck because it decreases your awareness of what is actually happening. And it is our awareness of what is actually happening that allows us to have the data we need to make better informed decisions.
Does it also, to some level, rob you of responsibility?
Absolutely, because although addiction is characterized by a loss of agency around our consumptive behaviors, we still have some degree of agency always, even if it's only enough to reach out and ask for help. And as people get into sustained recovery, they have a lot more agency, right, as they get out of that vortex of addiction. And it is that agency that we must employ to make the next best decision so that our lives will be this accumulation of small good decisions that then lead to good weeks and good months and good years.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.